What is Exvangelicalism? That is the topic of the series that we're doing next. And I have with me just me and Austin, the two hosts. Hi, Austin.
Hello, good to see you.
Good to see you too. So, Austin, this was initially your idea. You thought Exvangelicalism would be an interesting topic to explore as one of the challenges to faith. Tell me a little bit about why you were interested in this topic.
So, yeah, I think in some ways we both came up with it because it was on your list of possible topics, and that's what made me
Oh,
think
that's
of it.
true. I
Yeah,
share part of the
that's
responsibility.
right.
But I called it Post-Evangelicalism back then.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, which I think at some point we'll get into the different terms and maybe if they have slightly different meanings. But yeah, partly for me, I think moving back to the States, living in South Florida in a very kind of evangelical culture and seeing a lot more talk about evangelicalism than I had come across living in the UK. And I started to realize that this wasn't just people necessarily leaving evangelicalism, but also there was a whole kind of massive amount of communities being built that are themselves this thing called evangelicalism.
Yeah,
Um,
interesting.
so yeah, I realized there's a lot more to this than I think I had necessarily followed when I was outside of the country for 10 years, and seeing a lot of my own experiences connected with the kinds of things that people are kind of questioning and wrestling with. So I thought it might be interesting to look at what's going on there, what's driving that, what's some of the history, where are people going? And I think, we all know that evangelicalism is a really influential piece of kind of American history and politics,
Yeah, that's
particularly
right.
lately. So it's something worth thinking about, talking to some experts.
Yeah, I guess it is more of an American phenomenon than anywhere else. I'm sure there are evangelicals all over the world, but it's America where you see it reaching a sort of critical mass that becomes interesting. But I
Mm.
guess what everybody around the world will be interested in, everybody's interested in American politics. Everybody cared about the election, which we just saw going past. My friends and family in the UK were talking about it just as much as my American friends.
Mm.
And of course, part of the picture of that election and of the previous several elections has been the role of evangelicalism in propelling various candidates to the White House. And the reaction, I guess, evangelicalism is then the reaction against that by some evangelicals who no longer want to identify with the majority who say were influential in electing Donald Trump, for example.
Yeah, I think that you often hear in books and podcasts talking about people who sort of identify as evangelicals. They often start the story in 2016, and so I think that's a big piece of it. Also, I think we're just recognizing, evangelical is also a kind of polling term, right? That's we hear that in the news all the time. The evangelicals
Yes,
are this kind of voting bloc, this subset of the society, but that the meaning of that word has shifted significantly, right? And evangelicals in some ways name the people who no longer identify under that label, but a whole new group of people now do identify under that label, right? We have massive numbers of people who say they don't go to church, they haven't read their Bible, right? None of those kinds of things, but they're evangelical basically because they're Republican. And
that's
so,
right. It's
yeah.
fascinating, and it's very weird for people like me who grew up in the 90s when when being evangelical meant going to church every Sunday and reading your Bible every day. It
Mm,
couldn't not mean that because as evangelicals we were proud of being the real serious Christians as opposed to the not that serious Christians
mm.
who in the mainstream denominations or whatever.
Yeah, right. And I think, historically, that is kind of the roots of evangelicalism, were the people who said, right, real Christianity, the people, when everybody's technically a Christian around you, the evangelicals are the ones who said, let's take this seriously, let's pursue kind of spiritual disciplines, that kind of stuff. And that, I think, was true for me growing up, was that sense evangelicals were the ones that were like, this means something to us. We don't just go through the motions. So it's really interesting now that I think that term has flipped in many ways. And that's maybe, one of the questions I think we want to look at is what does that term mean, and how have those shifts impacted not only Christianity, but also the kind of broader culture and politics.
That's right. It's an obvious impact because now the polls continue to say that somewhere in the region of 80% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, for example. But that doesn't mean what it meant 8 years ago, because people who are self-identifying as evangelical are a different demographic.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. So I think it's a different group of people, and ex-evangelicals are the ones, right, who no longer fit in that category. And so they're the people who grew up as those evangelical Christians who now either are part of different denominations or have left the faith or have, entered different faiths. And so I think it's an interesting group to kind of talk with, think about as a piece of this broader demographic shift in Christianity. And of course, this has ramifications for global Christianity. American evangelicalism has always exported what it does and its media and its beliefs to the whole world. And so
that's right. You go anywhere in the world, you go to an evangelical church anywhere in the world, and you'll find books on being sold at the back written by Americans, and many of the songs will have been written by Americans, and people will be watching YouTube channels from America. So America does lead the evangelical world in many ways. So you're right that the changing of the meaning of the word evangelical and the emergence of this sort of shadow group that have abandoned evangelicalism, partly because of its political connotations, is going to have global significance for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it also, talking, I think, and hearing from people who have sort of left evangelicalism is really revealing on so many levels too, in terms of what they understood evangelicalism to be, what they understand Christianity to be, and really just where a large subset of, especially younger generations, what religion or faith even means to people, right? I think that this reveals a lot just in general about the place of faith in society and people's lives, in kind of our contemporary culture for probably primarily, millennials and Gen Z.
Yeah, totally. And so, I mean, I guess the thing about ex-evangelicalism is it's kind of, even as a name, it's defined by what it's not. It's defined by what it's against. But then that means we need to know a little bit about what evangelicalism is in order to understand this movement that's defining itself away from it. So I think we're going to do a couple of episodes on just what is evangelicalism, right?
Yeah,
as a backdrop.
Yeah, so we're going to talk to, historians and just try to get a sense of, you can't understand the thing that they're defining themselves against before we'd understand the thing. So what is evangelicalism? What has it been? What has it become? Is something that I think we want to wrestle with. And I think ex-evangelicalism even maybe adds some insight to that, right? Hearing from not just people who want to defend evangelicalism, but people who sort of have beef with it, add some layers of understanding maybe to what it looks like today.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if somebody wants to defend evangelicalism, they'll protest that the ex-evangelical hasn't really understood what evangelicalism really is, or whatever. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but they still understood it in a particular way for some reasons. And it's every evangelical will want to know what those reasons are. If they care about evangelicalism, they'll want to know so that they can stop more people from understanding it that way.
Yeah, and this is where I think, there have been a lot of reactions against evangelicals. There's a lot of discussion about what is the word they use, like deconstruction.
That word appears on my Twitter feed quite a lot.
Yeah, right. It's kind of, and some people are just saying, oh, these are just whiny young people deconstructing whatever. They're not faithful. They're not this and that. And I think, part of this discussion is to say that if you're really concerned about these people leaving evangelicalism and leaving these churches, why not listen to them and hear why that is, so that we can, at the very least, those who are committed to evangelicalism, why not get a deeper sense of why it's not giving sort of grace and life to people in the way that it did to you, right? In the way that it hopefully could.
Yeah, what can you learn from this about how you approach your faith, how the church is structured and does things to prevent this sort of exit from happening in the future?
Yeah. And then also, I think for me, what I've seen, one of the interesting things is that ex-evangelicals often are still so evangelical about leaving evangelicalism.
I know.
And so, I want to talk to some people about that. They're often following some charismatic, leader into some very unstructured thing where they're trying to do something, unique and on their own. There's so many the kind of layers to this that I'm always like, you're still very evangelical. And so I think that
Yeah.
also points to, I mean, it's an interesting thing about faith communities, right? There's sort of the doctrine, there's the kind of culture, there's all these layers, and seeing what of those layers maybe even is driving ex-evangelicalism itself, I think it would be kind of really interesting.
Yeah. I forgot what I was going to say about that.
So I think there's a lot of themes that we might want discuss throughout the podcast. I think that there are kind of common themes that come up a lot from what I see evangelicals talking about. Politics is going to be a big one. I think there are certainly a lot of ex-evangelicals who would say it wasn't really about Trump. There are a lot who would say it's purely about Trump. And again,
there's other issues that come up, aren't there? Like attitude towards sexuality, LGBTQ plus, attitude towards, some people just find the sort of dogmaticness of some evangelical claims to be a bit stifling. That they'll think that it doesn't make sense to treat the Bible as a sort of infallible text, for example.
Yeah, so particular ways of reading the Bible that have been common among evangelicals in the 20th century, I think, are a big one. People, especially when they get exposed to historical criticism, these kinds of questions. Race is a big one, right? People who are sort of interested in questions of racial discrimination, racial justice, that sort of stuff. Abuse is a big one, right? We've had some massive abuse scandals. I mean, as much as evangelicals did a lot of hand-wringing about abuse that happened in the Catholic Church, we now have these, widespread scandals that have come out in evangelical churches in America, abuse among pastors and leadership. And so those kinds of questions, we have really prominent pastors like Mark Driscoll and others, right, who have this kind of dramatic bullying, abusive persona, and we're seeing that as a broader pattern, not just sort of a one-off thing. So those kinds of questions, right? So I think across, right, there's quite a few different issues, and often it's a combination of these things, but sometimes, right, for individual people, it might be one of them is particularly big. The political one, too, I think is interesting because so many evangelicals have learned to fuse their faith with their politics so closely that sometimes a change in politics itself just necessitated, right? So I know a lot of people who say, I'm not a Christian anymore, I'm a Democrat, right? And
so, really?
Absolutely.
I've not heard that, gosh.
So that's right. That strong sense of being an evangelical Christian means being a Republican. If I'm no longer on board with Republican political views, then I can be a Christian. Says a lot about.
That certainly didn't used to be the case. Like when I was a missionary kid in Ecuador, I remember there were evangelicals who were proud to be Democrats. They were a minority and they were conscious of being a minority, but they still were happy to call themselves evangelicals. Yeah,
right. So, I mean, like the moral majority and this kind of alliance that happens, particularly in the 80s between evangelicals, grows in the 90s. And that hasn't been universal in evangelicalism, but it's been a massive, massive influence. And I think, and I hear this from older evangelicals too. So many that pray for their children because they're becoming Democrats and we're worried about their souls.
Wow. I think. But then I remember now my knowledge of American history is obviously the knowledge of somebody who's not an American. But I have learnt that the former president Jimmy Carter, who's still alive, isn't he? Just turned 100. Identifies as evangelical and he was elected as a Democratic president, right? In the 70s.
Yeah. Yeah, so it certainly is not historically the case that Republicans and evangelicals are sort of a one-to-one thing. And of course, also Democratic and Republican platforms kind of swapped at some point in the 20th century. But what's viewed as conservative or progressive and how evangelicals align, we know historically one of the main markers of evangelicalism earlier in American history was their progressive policies. They were the ones advocating for the poor, and they were advocating for more progressive policies around social issues. These things were a huge part of evangelicalism in its history, and in Britain as well, right? Before kind of the very early days of evangelicalism, we have the
I know about it in Britain,
all of that kind of stuff.
In Britain, we're very proud of people like William Wilberforce who advocated for the abolition of the slave trade, or like Elizabeth Fry, slightly less well known, but she advocated for prison reform, for more humane treatment of people in prison. And these evangelical figures who transformed society and brought levels of social justice that were hitherto unknown are are embedded in evangelical history and things that we're proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the U.S., things like the temperance movement were very much kind of Christian social justice, right? A concern with levels of kind of alcoholism and domestic abuse that were happening in the U.S. and tried to say, what if we just outlaw alcohol as a way to kind of protect women and children? We have, again, evangelicals are at the forefront of a lot of those things. So I think it's interesting to see this as a very unique point in time in many ways for this movement, but a really defining one, especially for ex-evangelicals.
Yeah, okay, so it's definitely worth analysis. It's one of the challenges to the Christian faith as a whole, insofar as every Christian is affected by what goes on in evangelicalism. The statistics are huge. There's like 600 million or something evangelicals, according to the normal definitions of evangelical around the world. That's far more than any individual Protestant denomination. It's not as many as all Protestants, but it's more than any particular Protestant group. And it's approaching about half the size of like the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church in terms of the sheer numbers. So it's a force in the Christian world that everybody needs to be aware of, and ex-evangelicalism is becoming its own force by contrast to it.
Yeah, and also if you think about especially the relationship between evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, and then Pentecostalism as this massive global force in Christianity, right? And the
charismatic movement more broadly, yeah.
So yeah, I think and ex-evangelicalism is, I think, connected to all of those kinds of things, just in terms of and so I think it's a really important thing to pay attention to, even if you're not evangelical. Right, these are the really significant kind of movements, and as theologians, it's particularly interesting to us just to say this is a kind of window into, for a large number of Western Christians, what it means to be Christian today for them, and we might have some questions to ask about that and kind of wrestle.
It's a perception of Christianity that everybody has to engage with, right?
Yeah.
You may think it's a false perception, you may not like it, but you can't change the fact that it is a perception, and so you need to know about it.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
This episode is sponsored by the Palm Beach Atlantic University School of Ministry. Located in the heart of West Palm Beach, Florida, PBA offers a range of undergraduate and graduate programs in theology, Bible, ministry, missions, chaplaincy, and apologetics. Learn more at pbaschoolofministry.com.